Weeks had passed since Inquisitor Maestus vanished within the labyrinths of the abandoned starship. Lacking any intelligence, the contingent of Astra Militarum dispatched 2 expeditions to locate the representative of the Holy Ordos. However, the idolaters of Shudamal ensured the unwelcome guests disappeared without a trace. Within a couple of weeks, the guardsmen already suspected something amiss, and the discovery of the Dark Magos was only a matter of time. Shudamal mobilized the majority of its supporters to awaken the machine spirit of the vessel, for leaving such knowledge on this god-forsaken world was highly inappropriate. While the cloaking shields concealed the ship's vital corridors, and corrupt Skitari quietly eliminated Imperial Guard squads, Magos Cassius worked on deciphering the infocrystals. One of them contained information exceedingly important to him. It spoke of a forge world named Ryza, located in the Ultima Segmentum. But another name for it surfaced in the Magos' mind, the Crucible of Shackled Stars. The data was very well preserved, as the archivist Magos were exceedingly meticulous in their work. The Age of Strife brought a multitude of trials to the population of Ryza, but they endured them with the characteristic resilience and stoicism of the cult of the Omnicia. At the time the Forge world was discovered by the Great Crusade, they had already achieved significant advancements, successfully travelling between the stars within their system and returning with resources to improve the planet's industry. The discovery of Ryza was a momentous event for the Imperium and significantly bolstered humanity's expansion ambitions. However, at the outset, the inclusion of Ryza sparked much debate, for some feared the vast amount of accumulated knowledge and resources. They were so abundant that the Forge could fully rival the Red Planet, and its industrial capacity surpassed many Forge worlds. Moreover, the Titans of Legio Crucius in combat prowess could contend with Legio Mortis, Ignitum, and Tempestus. According to colonist records, Ryza was once a flourishing planet with 2 continents separated by endless oceans teeming with life. 1,000 years before the arrival of the Imperium, everything changed completely. The green plains were replaced by dead wastelands devoid of all life. The outlines of both continents had virtually unchanged, but they were connected by a network of artificial isthmuses, each traversed by maglev trains. These transported goods between manufactorums with astonishing swiftness, ensuring the interaction of all Ryza's temple factories. The first settlement was named the City of Prosperity, and the first settled landmass became the founding continent. By the time of its discovery by the Imperium, it was already the least populated, as most resources had been plundered over the millennia. Despite this, the City of Prosperity still remained strong and directed the efforts of the entire northern continent towards the production of military equipment. Within the city's walls, the processing centers worked day and night to grade Ryza's output. Failed products were either melted down or discarded so that others might reuse them. Thus, the lifeblood of Ryza flowed through the City of Prosperity as blood through a human heart. From orbit, the City of Prosperity presented itself as a dense structure covering kilometers of surface, with metallic tendrils extending across the entire northern continent. The longest of these led to the Western Forges, where hundreds of workshops were exclusively engaged in the development of war machines for the Great Crusade. The continent's coastlines were dotted with recycling factories, their large, squat buildings the only viable intermediary points between the continental shelf and the sea. They interfaced via elevators and ramps, while the structures themselves remained anchored to the seabed with enormous pipes through which Ryza's industrial waste flowed. Further to the east lay the Isthmus of Salvation, the most crucial passage between continents. Although numerous such highways connected the 2 landmasses, it was from the Isthmus of Salvation that scavenger teams launched their expeditions. Devoted tech priests scoured the dried seabed for any valuable items that could be recovered and reused. The isthmus was particularly significant due to its proximity to Transport Terminal 9 Omega, the main spaceport for import and export. The isthmus was so vital that an artificial island was constructed along the northern coast, hosting a handful of Titans of the Legio Crucius to ensure any threat could be repelled. The second inhabited landmass was named the Continent of Erudition. For centuries it remained untouched, and on its western edge the Hierophant Technis established his capital. This position corresponded to the rank of Fabricator General of Holy Mars. The forge was built in the shadow of the House of Titans of the Legio Crucius, which was a hollow mountain named the Iron Fortress. On the outskirts of the capital, specialized manufactorums were established to support the warmongers. Further east of the continent lay the forge city of Endeavor, larger than the city of Prosperity to the north. While the latter specialized in production and recycling, the former served as a repository of knowledge, containing the archival catacombs underneath it, which held the sum total of Ryza's knowledge. As with its northern counterpart, the majority of the southern continent was dedicated to production. Thousands of forge shops manufactured the instruments of war, including essential components for the assembly of battle groups for the Imperial Navy. All products of these forges were sent eastward by trains, where they were placed in the warehouses of Transport Station 9 Omega, subsequently leaving the planet. Kilometers of streets ran through the vast warehousing facilities built around the spaceport. It was through Terminal 9 Omega that most of Ryza's transport flows passed, which is why Hierophant Technis put tremendous effort into establishing defensive lines around this area. In the surrounding lands, numerous anti-aircraft systems have been established to prevent any invaders from landing. Archival records of Ryza, as well as soil studies, confirm that the planet once had clean water. By the end of the 30th millennium, the oceans had dried up, and in their place emerged enormous waste reservoirs, which became known as the Sea of Reclamation. The exact reason for the ocean's desiccation remains undetermined, but it is undoubtedly due to every byproduct of Ryza's industry eventually finding its way into the oceanic depths. Now, due to geothermal sources on the ocean floor, as well as power stations scattered across the planet, the waste in the reservoirs remains in a semi-molten state. From the Isthmus of Salvation, small boats are dispatched to collect the refuse. Their servitors are specifically designed to operate in harsh conditions, allowing the refuse collection teams to successfully gather all valuable items, catalogue them, and transport them to manufactorums across Ryza for repurposing. Consequently, the world's industry remains operational, despite the lack of external resources. Another purpose of the Sea of Reclamation was to test an experimental theory rooted in religious devotion. According to this theory, the Omnicia communicates with his followers in various ways, and thus his cult on Ryza viewed the Sea of Reclamation as a direct link to the Omnicia. In its depths, the most unpredictable chemical reactions occur, as the byproducts, from factories and forges, interact with each other in the most unexpected ways. Over millennia, the results of these unexpected experiments were obtained by the tech priests, who roved the seas and praised the gifts of the Omnicia. The greatest minds of Ryza were tasked with unraveling the mysteries of such gifts, though the accuracy of their claims leaves much to be desired. Ryza's archives eloquently assert that discoveries made in the Sea of Reclamation helped to construct the first super-heavy tank, the Stormblade. Although the planet's prosperity was an indisputable fact, the archives revealed that fate had not always been kind to the Forge world. Ryza had been isolated and subjected to attacks by Xenos and warp spawns, and for some time defense against them could only be provided by the City of Prosperity. The population survived, but did not thrive, as centuries of war stripped it of any hope for a peaceful life without fear. As is often the case in the most desperate times, the people of Ryza clung to faith, calling upon the Omnissiah in hopes of deliverance. In a sense, their prayers were answered. The exact date of the emergence of the sect of tech priests known as the Omnissiah and Gvid is unknown, as are the identities of its founders. It is believed they became the saviors of Ryza in its darkest hours. Its name translates as the lifeblood of Omnicia, and the first techno-adepts held the belief that the Omnicia feels the pain of all its followers, and its blood spills across the galaxy whenever it is wounded. To them, the Omnicia is the fire of knowledge and power, and it is not ordinary substance that flows through its veins, but the very plasma that forms the beating hearts of its followers' creations. As the external threat grew, so did the influence of this religious clique. Their influence resonated in various theological teachings. Their beliefs rang true and eloquent, and the forges of Ryza began to explore plasma technologies to fend off attackers. The Forge world slowly transformed into a formidable force. By the time Ryza was discovered by the expeditionary fleets of the Great Crusade, members of the cult of the Omnicia were present in all structures of the planet. The sect had become an integral part of the world's essence, and its followers in all manifestations had gone far enough. They even replaced their blood with plasma and installed miniature plasma reactors in place of their hearts. The techno-priests of this sect had no desire to rule and believed that they were the blood of Ryza, not its brain, despite being deeply rooted in the political structures of the planet. The best representatives of the cult of the Omnicia met the imperial delegation after the planet's discovery. One of the emissaries noted in his report that their passion burns hotter than the furnace, that a strange mysticism is inherent in them, as it is to all followers of the machine god. But they are no stranger than those who have chained the stars within their hearts. Thus, Ryza earned the honorable nickname Furnaces of Chained Stars. Essentially, this equates to recognition of their superior knowledge and skills in the development and production of plasma technologies. In this, the priesthood of Ryza has no equals outside their world. Your emotion inhibitors are malfunctioning. A being dressed in the tattered robe of a techno-priest said, appearing in the doorway. Its legs had been replaced with spider-like appendages, and tainted oils dripped from the mechadendrites. Did you find information about your home world? Yes, replied Magus Udamel. I once considered Ryza my home, but then I had to leave that planet. There were too many contradictions at that time. What kind? Many representatives of the Imperium advocated for unity, as all the advantages of the alliance outweighed the potential harm a Forge world might pose to humanity. Cold pragmatism outweighed all emotions, and Ryza was offered full vassalage under Terra and Mars. To the surprise of the Imperium, the techno-priests accepted this offer without much disagreement and transitioned under the full control of the Emperor. At that moment, the Imperial archives were supplemented with data on the heraldry of the new ally. It is still believed that the emblem includes the letter R as the first letter of the name, a part of which includes a skull and cog, symbolizing kinship with Mars. The cloaks of Skitarii and tech priests are colored ochre, echoing the hue of the rusted dunes of the planet. As with many Forge worlds, the soldiers of Ryza often wear purity seals made of blood wax and parchment to show their freedom from corruption. The attire and armor of the highest clergy of Ryza are distinguished by an abundance of rich crimson elements. The more red present, the higher the rank. This same color is found on the linings of warriors' cloaks and on details of war machines. Copper is used to highlight weapon details, for instance, on the electrostaff's fulgurites, as well as on the mechadendrite harnesses Magasha. Although Legio Cybernetica of Ryza uses an extensive variety of symbols, their robots' color schemes invariably include ochre, dark red, silver, and black. The color pattern of each maniple usually resonates with the scheme of the designated Infocore. Despite Ryza's loyalty, discontented whispers among the high echelons of Terra persist, with many speaking of it with the same level of reverence once reserved for Mars itself. Of course, many Forge worlds served as the beating hearts of the Collegia Titanica combat units, but no one considered improving them due to fear of consequences or simply due to disappointment in such technology. Hierophant Technis Nira Helgentun knew that even as part of the Imperium, the planet would one day face attack and sought to garner as many allies as possible. Thanks to its knowledge and technology, Ryza's renown grew rapidly, making the planet second in influence only to Mars. With such a position, the ruling elite found it convenient to weave a web of political alliances, offering patronage in exchange for assistance in times of danger. The first prototype of the Lemon Rust tank with the Executioner model was made in Ryza's forges, and the super-heavy Stormblade was conceived by them as a means to negotiate with Mars, as the Red Planet was unwilling to share the secrets of creating the Shadow Sword self-propelled artillery. Ultimately, The Stormblade was handed over to smaller forges in exchange for appropriate compensation. The Hierophant Technis believed that the power of the Red Planet would significantly diminish by the end of the war, and Ryza could take its place. But after the Horus heresy, she claimed the opposite, although it was obvious to all that her ambitions went beyond mere survival. Ryza suffered much more during the war than Mars, making all suspicions meaningless, and the planet took an honourable place in the Imperium of mankind. But even before the heresy, many tech priests on the Red Planet were also dissatisfied, ambitious individuals who envied the special status of Magos Sophrisa within the Mechanicum at large. These embittered individuals whispered their thoughts to Warmaster Horus about attacking the forges of the polished stars, hoping to claim all the wealth for themselves. You decided to avoid that war, but why join us now? You know we are not particularly loved in the Imperium of mankind, do you? Asked Shudamel. It would have been easier for you to align with the one called the true Fabricator General of blessed Mars. Kelbohal is not the sole ruler of the new Mechanicum, replied Cassius. Any heretic forge can become a mighty stronghold and power capable of opposing the Imperium. Furthermore, knowledge permeates the very essence of the universe, thus it is foolish to remain in one place. Sensible, hissed Shudamel. From beneath his tattered robe emerged a mechadendrite with a glowing crystal. Here is everything I know about Ryza. The rest of the data lies somewhere within this ship. With these words, the Dark Magos departed, and Cassius read the information from the crystal. When the Horus heresy began, the Magos and Ryza directed their efforts towards constant support of the Imperium, rejecting the offers of the Warmaster and his emissaries. They sent offers of assistance and calls for unity throughout the segments of Ultima and beyond. Through their actions, the Magos aimed to reforge those broken by Kelbohal's betrayal, provide refuge for the priests exiled from the Red Planet, who refused to break their oaths of allegiance to Tevi, and prevent their allies from falling into the abyss of extinction. Once the word spread far enough, orphaned souls were drawn towards the crucible of the bound stars. Though war ravaged much of the surrounding segmentum, Ryza remained free from abhorrent conflicts, but its growing power did not go unnoticed. As they approached the solar system, the Warmaster took note of all who might threaten his flanks with any degree of probability, and thus could not ignore such a powerful enclave. The honour of attacking Ryza fell to Eurytus Amicron, the locus fabricator of Esteban VII. In accordance with Horus's command, 140 Titans from Legio Vulturum Mortis and Legio Magna were assembled into a single fist. They were joined by the knightly houses of Morbidia and Raborn, as well as a massive tagmata of the Dark Mechanicum supported by monsters corrupted by scrap code. These forces advanced from the outskirts of the Beta Garmon system towards Ryza. Horus commanded them to cripple this forge world, yet the predatory Dark Mechanicum had their own plans for the planet. By that time, Ryza was not only guarded by the forces of Legio Crucius, but also by the resurrecting power of several other Legio and knightly houses. Among them were the Knights of House Taranis and House Zavora, ancient families summoned to Mars since the Age of Strife, as well as Legio Honorum and Legio Osedax, who had allocated part of their contingent to Ryza under previously established pacts. But it was not only these forces that awaited the Warmaster's troops on their approach to Ryza, for in centuries of resisting external threats, Hierophant Technis had seen to the creation of the first line of defense. This role was taken by the artificial moon Ryza Secundus. Its macro docks had once housed entire expeditionary fleets, vast cargo bays filled with munitions to satiate the insatiable thirst for conquest of the Great Crusade. From the vast cargo holds, trains laden with ammunition rushed toward them, while in the adjacent docking modules, ships were being modified in accordance with the dogmas of the Amuncia Kvith. Ryza Secundus posed a significant threat to the fleet of traitors, as the might of their Titan legions meant little in the void of space. Avoiding a direct assault, the traitors meticulously devised their plans and dispatched a vanguard. Several weeks before the main forces were sent, The arrival of this vanguard was marked by anomalous sensor readings weeks before the invasion. Distant monitoring stations registered a brief warp engine discharge associated with the appearance of ships from the ether, which turned out to be anomalous sensor ghosts. As the number of such sightings increased, scout cruiser patrols combed the system in search of the enemy, but they found nothing except the endless void. Over time, these readings were attributed to turbulent warp storms in the neighboring sectors, but the inability to detect the enemy did not mean their complete absence. Each had the form of a traditional Mechanicum cruiser, but their designs were significantly altered. Entire sections were removed to create additional cargo holds, each loaded with lobotomized combat servitors, corrupted Skitarii, and flying mechanical constructs. To avoid detection, the ships were equipped with only the faintest hint of engines and drifted through the system solely by inertia, making them invisible. After a month, these improvised transports approached Ryza Secundus, and due to the vagaries of the warp, time was greatly shortened, after which the main part of the renegade fleet materialized near Ryza. 80 ships revealed themselves and their intentions. The Loyalists were ready for combat, but were outnumbered, as their fleet was in the shadow of Ryza Secundus and barely counted 20 ships. The remaining barges had been handed over to the Imperium decades before this event and had not yet returned to their home docks. The Ryza fleet did not wish to engage without support from the satellite's guns and watched the enemy's approach, waiting for a trap. The disguised fleet attempted to slip past the defending forces, but one of the Loyalist Nova-class frigates first sounded the alarm as it collided with one of the disguised barges during a routine maneuver. Dozens of cries echoed through internal communication channels as the Loyalists sought an explanation for what had happened. But the answer came when the hidden vanguard activated their engines and launched their projectiles. New signatures flared up on the sensors and thousands of boarders arced across the void, approaching Ryza Secundus. Hundreds were destroyed by the satellite's defensive systems, but no firepower could stop them all. Damage signatures were recorded all over the station's hull. Melter charges placed in the noses of the boarders breached new paths through the shell. With their cursed wraiths, assault units of the Dark Mechanicum breached the corridors of Ryza Secundus and brought death to all who were within. Against them stood the Skitarii forces and the Knights of House Warhammer, who had suffered during the betrayal at Calth, as the attacks of the Word-bearers had significantly reduced their numbers. The survivors yearned for death and vengeance. Some darkened the bright colours of their armour as a sign of mourning. Only a few accepted new armour from Ryza in exchange for parts of restored forces to defend the crucible of Starforged. A dozen of these newly minted knights stood guard on Ryza Secundus, while another 24 proudly stood on Ryza itself. For many, the upcoming battle was to be their first real foray into the whirlpool of war, and at the same time, it was to be their last. When an innumerable multitude of enemies surged towards them in attack, not one shirked their duty, pushing the enemy back in every battle. If it weren't for their small numbers, Ryza Secundus might have stood longer. Alas, a dozen knights could not defend all the cargo holds and halls of the vast station. Every victory they achieved was accompanied by dozens of defeats in other places. Section by section, the Loyalist forces were driven inward, retreating before the relentless assault of the traitors, and the defensive power of the satellite gradually diminished. Reinforcements for the traitors came from House Morbidia, who had sworn allegiance to Kelbohal. Facing them, the House Vornhair representatives realized their doom, for the arriving enemy was equal in power, but not in numbers or honor. In the final hours of Ryza Secundus's fall, communication between the planet and the station was severed, replaced only by interference. Plasma battery flashes in the void were the only sign that resistance continued. Sustained reports tell of a valiant last stand fought by the Knights of House Vornhair. The surviving defenders entrenched around the central command post in the heart of Ryza Secundus and sold their lives dearly. Extracted data speaks of a fierce 6-hour battle that claimed the lives of dozens of Morbidia knights. The fight ended when the damaged batteries of Ryza Secundus in a final salvo destroyed the enemy battleship Omnisia's benediction. Decades later, the names of the 12 brave souls who defended Ryza Secundus were engraved on a 20-meter fragment of its hull, adorned with precious stones. When Ryza Secundus fell silent, the few surviving ships immediately withdrew from the fight and hastened to the system's borders, following pre-received orders to request help from allies and return fully armed. The fleet of the traitors took orbit around Ryza, positioning themselves beyond the reach of ground-based guns. The surface braced for an impact, but it came from a very unexpected direction. On Ryza's surface, the enemies were awaited by a fifth of the entire Legio Crucius, Knights of House Taranis and Zavora, as well as the few remaining Vornheer. Despite the loss of the first line of defense, the might of the Tagmata of Ryza remained formidable. Consequently, the supporters of Lupercal did not hasten to land on the surface. To carve a path for themselves, the renegades resorted to a long-proven and reliable means. The War Master had long before embedded agents into the society of Ryza, who, at the appointed hour, struck at the forges and manufactorums. Lacking preparation, the rebels relied only on their own strength and captured weapons. They attacked food convoys, hindered troop movements, and sabotaged the infrastructure in every possible way. They could not harm the knightly houses or the Legion of Titans, but they could weaken the defense of Ryza by delivering blows. The fatal stroke was delivered 19 days after the fall of Ryza Secundus. A tech priest, seduced by the promise of Kelbahal, took control of one of the forged temples of the southern continent. Such a loss jeopardized the vital supply route to Terminal 9 Omega, and gave the enemy access to battle machines, including Stormblade super-heavy tanks. In response, a battle group of Legio Honorum marched on the temple, destroying anyone who tried to oppose them. In their absence, Terminal 9 Omega was left protected only by the Knights of House Joden, and under their watch, the traitors attacked the starport at 9 Omega. When the first enemy ship broke through the clouds, the starport's warning signals were ignored. So confident was Hierophant Technis in her defense. Only when dozens of enemies descended onto Platform 9 Omega did alarm begin to rise. When communication with the starport was lost, an appropriate command was sent to Principe Senioris Galhitz, commander of the battle group of Legio Honorum, who was at that moment engaged in the siege of the Forge Temple. The Titans hurriedly turned and headed for the starport. 4 hounds rushed ahead to ascertain how the enemies had neutralized the defenses of 9 Omega as soon as possible. When the battle group entered the storage area, no signs of House Joden were found, and Galhetz feared for the fate of their allies. All attempts to contact them were disrupted by a stream of indecipherable binary code and snippets of vox shouts. In the first wave of enemies were spotted the Titans of Legio Vulturum, and the Titans of Honorum rushed to intercept to prevent the enemy's landing. This endeavor proved fatal. The first to detect movement on his auspex was the Principes of the god machine Inexhaustible. He managed to turn and see Cerastus pattern knights in the liveries of House Joden, whose hands crackled with spears. Moments later, the leg mechanisms of the Inexhaustible were severed by a sudden attack. The god machine swayed and crashed to the ground. From surrounding buildings, the Knights of House Joden opened fire. The void shields of Honorum fell, and then their engines failed. The betrayal was fully revealed. In the ensuing chaos amidst the crossfire, few noticed that the first transport of Legio Vulturum had landed on the platforms of the starport. In mounting desperation, Galhex commanded his Titans to unleash their full might upon the spaceport, preventing the enemy from seizing such coveted spoils. Each Princeps staked their life, disregarding the enemy knights scurrying beneath their feet. When the first enemy Titans scaled the walls of the spaceport to return fire, only 2 flame-shrouded war machines remained of the Legio Honorum. The last report from Princeps Galhex was filled with bitter curses as he overloaded the reactor of his god machine in a final act of suicidal defiance. Spaceport 9 Omega was captured, and the gates to Ryza were thrown wide open. Legio Vulturum advanced westward across the southern continent, dispersing the gathered strength of the Acidax en route, while Titans of Legio Mordaxis began landing at landing pad 9 Omega. Beyond the Sea of Reclamation, Legio Magna embarked on a pursuit of the fleeing instigators of war. To this end, the Flaming Skulls, supported by tank companies and Knights of House Araborn, landed at the City of Prosperity, sweeping away all in their path. Archives indicate that it was to the City of Prosperity that the surviving elements of Legio Crucius retreated, joining forces with the surviving maniples of Honorum and the surviving scions of House Varnhem. For Ryza, the City of Prosperity was a vital link in the production chain of plasma reactors for Titans and starships. Though primarily focused on production, it was also a mighty fortress capable of withstanding fierce assaults. The fortitude of its walls had been proven numerous times during the Age of Strife. Though a century had passed since the last assault on the city, the Mechanicum meticulously maintained the bastion's condition. The forge was encircled by a 10-metre thick wall of adamantium. It was guarded by battalions of Skitari and Ryza's Tagmata tech priests. Specially designated firing ports housed plasma annihilators, upon which Hierophant Technis relied to repel the attack of the renegades. However, both sides understood that the city was too valuable to be thoughtlessly destroyed, so the Loyalists confronted the enemy outside as they marched across Ryza's dead wastelands. Legio Magna Titans preferred to meet their foe face-to-face, favouring direct assaults, but they exposed themselves to the city's defensive weaponry in doing so. Therefore, the leading Warlord-class Titans shielded those behind with their void shields. The Loyalists managed to bring down the shields of one Warlord and eliminate it along with 2 Reavers. However, simple attrition warfare was not the only tactic available to the Loyalists. Defending the Salvation Isthmus, Legio Crucius also faced a contingent of Legio Magna and endured their bloodthirstiness. Yet as both sides traded fire, the hounds of Legio Honorum dared to advance and harry Magna's flanks. Although their attacks did not pose a significant threat, the attacking commanders, deviating from the formation and pursuing the retreating Titans of the traitors, easily became targets for Legio Crucius. Ultimately, the enemy was lured into an area with old defunct mines, which had been buried long before the City of Prosperity was founded. There lay an ancient weapon, awakened by the released stream of binary cant. Spider-like limbs emerged from the mines and attacked the advancing Titans. Chaos and confusion swept through the ranks of Legio Magna, and their orderly lines began to disintegrate as the ancient weapon dismantled the powerful god machines. In response, Magna's Titans unleashed devastating scrap code streams and took control of the nearest mines, and then their main forces collided with the Loyalist defence line with close combat weapons, paying little heed to their own survival. A fierce battle broke out at the heart of the Loyalist forces at the gates of the City of Prosperity, and their flanks quickly shifted in an attempt to distance themselves from the scrap code-infected mines. Eventually, Legio Honorum, on the left flank, retreated too far and opened a path for 3 traitor commanders, Firefist, Doom's Emissary, and Invocatio Ignis, to break through the outer wall, from the tops of which they were under fire. An entire section of the wall collapsed in mere moments, and more maneuverable units entered the city. As panic-filled cries spread across the Vox, the Titan legions and sheets concentrated their efforts on patching the breaches, reducing the pressure on the enemies. As one, Legio Magna surged forward. When all semblance of order and coherence vanished from both camps, 3 Titans of Magna passed through the breach, showering defenders with plasma and strikes from giant claws, followed by allied raiders covering their flanks from the Loyalists. The triumphant howl of burning skulls echoed in the vicinity, for they anticipated swift victory and respect in the eyes of Horus. A small group of defenders confronted the invading commanders, and the Firefist's princeps had already tasted victory, grinning a skull-like smile, his vision narrowing, and fists clenching in rhythm with the reactor's furious heartbeat. The machine spirit howled with bloodthirst, but a moment later fell silent when a counter-echo sliced through the maelstrom of battle. 3 explosions struck Firefist, destroying its head and crew with it. As the god machine toppled to the ground, 3 Nemesis Titans of Legio Honorum appeared on the battlefield, led by Princeps Uriena Golonir, commanding the Titan Pride of Ryza. Engaging the traitors, they destroyed Doom's emissary and Invocatio Ignis, and then the Loyalists focused their efforts on the crowded machines in the breach, and soon their burning hulks plugged the gap in the wall. Legio Magna understood that fortune had turned against them and hastened to retreat, but during the withdrawal, several were also felled and crashed to the ground. The entire plain before the City of Prosperity was engulfed in smoke, its surface littered with the shattered remains of Titans and tens of thousands of smaller war units. Both sides regrouped, and the renegades deliberated their next steps. The Princeps of the Dark Mechanicum insisted on a renewed attack, for the tainted machine spirits thirsted for blood. But their demands were dismissed by the locus fabricator Eurytus Omicron, who urged them to temper their fervour and wait precisely one night. In the city, clandestine cults became active, their rituals summoning black clouds over the city. Positioned before the wall, the Loyalists awaited a renewed assault, but instead a bloody rain poured down upon them. Red rivers flowed through the streets of the prospering city, causing nausea to all who touched them. Following this came a corrupted wind that drove people mad, forcing them to attack one another. Throughout the night, insane cries rang through the city, replaced later by the loud, otherworldly roar of an ancient, terrifying creature. In an instant, all mechanisms within the walls fell silent and the city was plunged into darkness. None of the Loyalists at the gates dared to move for fear of falling into an ambush within the walls. The City of Prosperity was abandoned to its fate. Messages about the Forge's final moments were at best contradictory, as they were pieced together from distorted pick captures and damaged Vox logs. The scant information that could be discerned pointed to an illness or corruption within the city's information network, which exhibited a certain degree of sentience. Mere minutes after this infoweb corruption made itself known, reports of grotesque constructs leaping from the shadows and attacking spread through the Vox. These constructs were assembled from the remnants of shattered machines torn from the manufactorum of Ryza. They appeared to be guided by a single mind, and they killed all they encountered. Towards dawn, the screams subsided, and the Knights of House Vornher were tasked with assessing the situation in the city, while the Titan legions remained to guard the approaches. Surviving testimonies indicate that the city was completely flooded with blood, with no trace of the enemy who had orchestrated the massacre. Nor were the bodies of the dead found. The only remaining residents of the city were nauseating odours and a sense of unease. Realizing there was nothing left to defend, the Loyalists retreated. The City of Prosperity was abandoned to the invader. On the southern continent, maniples of Legio Vulturum divided the Loyalist forces. Unlike Legio Magna, they were not known for direct engagements. In the weeks following the fall of the Isthmus of Salvation, they divided their cohorts into 3 parts with the aim of capturing specific segments of the southern continent. Once they had sated themselves with the destruction of resistance, Magnus Sauer of Legio Mortis gathered the remnants of the Legio and the Knights of Morbidia. Utilizing information from secret agents, Sau launched a swift assault on the temple forge of Cascod atop the mountain. Overnight, House Morbidia broke through the Loyalist defences and seized monitoring stations intended for observing the surrounding lands and airspaces. From there, the Princeps advanced with the goal of decapitating the Loyalist command at Endeavour City, for there the resistance was personally led by Hierophant Technis. Aside from its primary functions, Endeavour was the residence of Nera Heldentun, and her removal would have completely demoralized the Loyalists of Ryza. With a coordinated strike, Legio Mortis and Vulturum repelled a small strike group of Magi. Unprepared for the sudden ferocity of the traitors' attack, the Loyalist forces found themselves incapable of organizing a counterattack, and the enemy Titans encircled the city. Soon, the renegades captured the city. Its defences fully succumbed to the Dark Mechanicum and were bolstered by Titans. Nera Heldentun managed to evade capture, and enemy hunters scoured the city in search of her. The The news that Hierophant Technis was alive remained the sole glimmer of hope for all those trapped within the walls of Endeavour. The resistance was fierce, and the nights were lit by fires and flashes of crossfire. However, such resistance was futile without proper support, and the few messages that trickled out beyond the walls of Endeavour increasingly contained pleas for assistance. For time was scarce, and the renegades were close to annihilating the loyalist resistance pockets and displaying the tattered uniform of Hierophant Technis. The surviving loyalists gathered on the outskirts of the city. With them still were the knights of House Tyrannus and Zavora. In response to Nera Heldentun's calls, only 11 titans of Legio Secutari answered. The rest were too embroiled in conflict with the maniples of Vulturum to withdraw from battle. Yet these 11 volunteers faced the necessity of launching a suicidal attack on Endeavour, as the city was surrounded by barren plains, hills of scrap metal, and abandoned warehouses, which were the only cover on the path to the city walls. The task was complicated by the fact that the superior titans of Mortis and Vulturum stood guard and raked the wastelands with their fire. While the sense of duty wrestled with pragmatism, Endeavour burned, and no one among the gathered Legio could conceive a way out of the situation. Vox records emphatically assert that at some point Princeps Nuas of Legio Secutarii succumbed to despair and ordered a retreat. However, the Allies defied the order and shamed the Princeps, and the Legio advanced towards the city despite monstrous losses. Unfortunately, the Secutarii were already stepping over the scattered remnants of god machines to unleash their wrath upon the traitors. In the shadows of the Titans, the forces of Houses Tyrannus and Zavora moved unnoticed. They advanced towards the walls contrary to orders, driven not by a desire for a glorious death in battle, but by something else. They bitterly recalled how the new faith of Mars had deprived them of their homeland. Nearly 200 orphaned knights had found refuge on Ryza, and they were unwilling to lose their new home. Thus, they charged directly towards the thundering guns of the enemy Titans. The guns of Mortis and Vulturum unleashed their fury with unrestrained pleasure, aided by their enhanced plasma batteries. The number of loyalists behind the walls of Endeavour dwindled with every passing minute. City records state that only 49 knights reached the walls. Entering the city proved easier than reaching it, for the wall was breached in several places. It is believed that the first devastating blow was delivered by Knight Castigator Cerastus in the Gladius Ignum from House Tyrannus. He destroyed the stabilizers of the ancient raider Mors Fadus, created during the Dark Age of technology. Bolstered by the sight of the fallen Titan, Princeps Nuas and his battle group quickened their pace, intensifying the pressure on the retreatants as the loyalist knights swept through their ranks. The breakthrough in the defences marked a pivotal moment in the battle for Endeavour. Much like in the battle for Terminal 9 Omega, the city's streets gave the loyal knights an advantage and concealed them from the wrath of the Dark Mechanicum's guns and titans. The knights encircled 4 titans, while others found themselves trapped between the city's resistance and the attacking loyalist titans outside. It was then that Princeps Zhao ordered the ranks to close and the void shields to be combined. Each manipule faced the attackers, their tactics minimizing the damage from the Tyrannus and Zavora knights' attacks. However, the intensity of fire on the advancing titans decreased. Zhao's maneuvers were aimed at buying time for the Morbidia knights operating in Endeavour, but he did not anticipate that his manipules would become easy prey for the Sedax. Princeps Nuas immediately exploited this change in tactics. Under his command, the Titan's doomed warrior and lost son surged forward and unleashed a merciless barrage of rockets. Zhao and the machine spirit of Vitamis Harem roared in defiance simultaneously, directing their weapons towards the advancing raiders. In the next second, the volcanic cannon struck down the lost sun with a barrage that heated Vitamis Harem's reactor to a red glow. The machine spirit filled with a thirst for blood and took complete control over the commander. Princeps realized too late that the Sedax had prepared a fate other than just death for themselves. The Titan had already turned into a walking bomb. Dozens of rockets streaked over the doomed warrior's armor, overloading Vitamis Harem's shields. and when the reactor exploded, the Titan commandant disintegrated, and the subsequent explosion consumed the nearby machine god. When the blazing supernova subsided, the surrounding city quarters turned into a molten crater, within which 7 Titans of Legio Mortis smouldered. The sudden loss of the god machines of Mortis undermined the fighting spirit of the retreatants in Endeavour, and tactical planning gave way to the instinct of self-preservation. Legio Vulturum also decided to retreat, although they still maintained numerical superiority. In a final act of betrayal, Vulturnum turned their weapons on Legio Mortis, who tried to stop their retreat. Chaos reigned among the ranks of Horus's supporters. While the enemies tore each other apart, the surviving loyalists emerged from the shadows, and Hierophant Technis ordered the opening of Ryza's secret military vaults, sealed with ancient protocols. At another time, such an action would have been considered techno-heresy, for forbidden technologies were stored there. But she decided it would be better to beg for forgiveness in the future than to witness the fall of Ryza in the present. Ultimately, the secrets of Ryza, concealed from the Imperium, were revealed when loyalists fought for their home. Reports indicate that, after Nera Heldentun's decision, representatives of a previously unknown night house named Sidus were observed in the whirlpool of battles. Emerging from the dungeons of Endawar, the knights joined forces with the remnants of Taranis and Zavora, helping to expel traitors beyond the city limits. On that day, the Loyalists claimed a new victory, and the battle for Ryza entered a new phase. Securing Endawar, allies gathered behind the city's walls. Their numbers grew as battered maniples cut their way through the dispersing forces of the traitors. Deprived of their titans, the traitor ranks diminished, while the Titans of Legio Magna were dispersed across the continent in attempts to keep up with the smaller detachments of Legio Honorum and Legio Crucius. Nera Heldentun understood that the battle was not yet won. Therefore, she hastened to endow her home planet with advantages. Time was not her ally, and she called upon the magos of the cogitators of erudition, who guarded hidden knowledge from all. They fastened ancient relics, retrieved from secret vaults to the divine machines. Their techno-rites were fraught with risk, as the energy contained within the hulls could destroy the weapon if misused. The contents of the techno-vaults remain secret to this day, and records of the weapon's use were erased, so the Magos of Ryza would not face censure. But rumors circulate that traitors were torn to shreds by a single shot, and their remains vanished into ethereal vortices, leaving behind only the howling of unnatural voices. Some reports mentioned god machines in the liveries of Legio Crucius, whose size eclipsed that of a warlord-class titan. Speculations about the origin of such mechanisms remained conjectures, as the Magos dismissed all inquiries regarding the final weeks of the battle for Ryza. Armed with new weaponry, the Knights of House Sidus marched across the southern continent, encountering minimal resistance. Scattered battalions of corrupted Skitarii and battered tank companies of the Tagmata of the Dark Mechanicum fought the advancing loyalists in vain, but Legio Vulturum sold their lives dearly, leaving ruins in their wake. Severely affected by traitor attacks, Nera Heldentun slowed the pursuit and preferred to gather all necessary information before taking the next step. To this end, she dispatched the Knights of Sidus to retake Mount Cascud and reclaim the Forged Temple on its summit. This territory was held by the Knights of House Morbidia. Within a few hours, the superior firepower of the Loyalists broke the back of the War Master's supporters, driving all survivors off the slope. Following this, the tech priests of Ryza were ordered to enter the forge to activate monitoring stations and gather all information on enemy movements. But they returned empty-handed. At the site of the forge lay smouldering ruins, for Legio Vulturnum had leveled all structures to the ground before retreating. Similar reports were coming in from across the planet. Enemy Titans left ruins in their wake and moved toward Terminal 9 Omega. This decision was made by Eurytus Omicron, for he no longer deemed it possible to capture Ryza but feared the wrath of the War Master. Therefore, he felt it necessary to inflict maximum damage on the planet so that the population would be engaged in restoration for decades. Following this, he planned to withdraw the war-capable units through the starport so they could participate in combat in other parts of the galaxy. The princeps of the Descending Skulls did not agree with Omicron's orders, as after the conquest of the City of Prosperity, they had blazed bloody trails across Ryza, significantly reducing the numbers of Legio Honorum and Legio Crucius. It took considerable effort for Omicron to convince them to cease their pursuit, echoing warp-born rumors of approaching loyalist reinforcement fleets to Ryza, which would doom the invaders. All except the most irrational princeps of Legio Magna complied with the order and retreated across the isthmus to safety. Following the orders, Titans unleashed their wrath on every structure in their path. Of all that was conquered, only the City of Prosperity survived, its ghostly ruins standing as a reminder of the fate of all who dared to oppose the warlord. Gathering on the starport platforms, the renegades began to slowly embark on transporters and head into orbit, leaving the world they had bled dry. Two-thirds managed to reach orbit before the terminal was attacked by loyalists. None of the traitors dared to risk their lives to save those left on the surface, where 11 Titans of Legio Vulturnum and 14 God Machines of Legio Magna, forming the core of the Dark Mechanicum's attacking forces on Ryza, remained. Facing imminent doom, they vowed to sell their lives dearly and wound Ryza so deeply that the wound would fester for a long time. 60 loyal Titans lined up in a single front and attacked the surviving enemies. Both sides sought nothing but the death of the adversary and paid no heed to the collateral damage. From the north, Basilisk raiders armed with melter guns and chain fists attacked the warlords of Legio Vulturum, and the heated battle saw plasma discharges, piercing the enemy God Machine's armor. When the Vulturums were pushed back, packs of hounds from Legio Magna fell upon the flanks of the Ossidacs, but they were met with fire from the most prized machines of Ryza, untamed power. Their deadly rain annihilated 5 enemy hounds. Everyone knows that Beta Garmon saw a true Titan slaughter, but few know that the real Titan death occurred on Ryza. Cassius muttered to himself and continued. The conflict to the north of the terminal was merely a skirmish compared to the battle in the west, where the main forces of the Loyalists were concentrated. Packs of hounds sprang from the shadows of the commanders, and the maniples of Lupercal attacked the enemy from all flanks, but could not halt the Loyalists' advance towards the spaceport. Leading the assault wave were 6 Warlord-class Titan engines, among which was the Legio Crucius commander Grunal Crom aboard the Titan Glory Above Pride. The God Machines burst into the enemy's battle ranks and opened fire. The hounds of Legio Vulturum, Death's Shadow and Mors Desperandum returned fire upon the Ganorum raiders, but the Guardian of Virtue purposely overloaded its reactor in a surge of vengeful wrath to eliminate the hounds one by one. Cascades of explosions disabled the Titan, making it an easy target for the Knight of Araborn. Their rusted weapons brought the God of War to the ground, followed by the punch of Vulturnum's commander to its faceplate. The battle for Terminal 9 Omega raged for 13 hours, with the Loyalists retreating slightly after the 6th hour to avoid friendly fire. Though the ferocity of the battle flared and ebbed, neither side yielded, as the Titans of both forces fought to the last breath. The Titan Sanguinem Luna from Legio Vulturum was the last surviving enemy Titan. Its hull was stripped of armor plates in dozens of places and was cloaked in flames spewing from a breached reactor. Having exhausted its ammunition, it charged forward to meet the trio of advancing Crucius commanders. Grunal Crom's hatred echoed through the Vox as he mocked the approaching traitor. Moments later, he ordered fire across the entire battlefield, and Ryza's pride executed his command. A shot from the volcano cannon pierced the enemy's back, condemning it to an ignominious death. When the lights of Sanguinem Luna dimmed, silence reigned over the spaceport for the first time in a long period. Though Kagmata of Ryza managed to expel Lupercal's forces from the surface, they were in no hurry to celebrate victory. Eurytus Omicron continued bombarding the planet from orbit for several weeks, as a parting gift before departing, fearing the arrival of Loyalist reinforcements. When the last fire was extinguished, only 1/5 of the Forge World's infrastructure remained operational, with the rest reduced to nothing more than blackened ruins. Although Omicron failed in his desire to seize Ryza, he returned to the warrior victors, for the crucibles of the shackled stars were no longer beacons of hope, and the devastated world became a stark example of the tragic fate awaiting the entire galaxy. Cassius finished reading. Shudamel appeared in the doorway once more, but this time with 3 idolothrexes. "We can no longer hide in these ruins," he said. "We are taking off. We will leave as best we can and take all this knowledge with us. If you still hesitate, there is time to leave and remain as you were. Fly with us, and there will be no turning back." "What is your decision, Cassius?" "I am with you," replied Shudamel. The dark mage nodded, and streams of binary code surged through the air. From the relays emerged blessed litanies. The ship shuddered, and somewhere in the distant corridors, gunfire erupted. "Have you found something interesting arise? Or perhaps something that could evoke emotions? Surely there was a reason you blocked them." "What happened in the City of Prosperity?" replied Cassius. "I have already seen it." "And where?" "That company represented a brief blitzkrieg war, and it was unlikely to have been preserved except in a few reports by little-known tech priests. It happened on the planet Ascalon 3 in the Ultima Segmentum. Currently, the Cartographica Imperialis considers Ascalon a dead system, but it was not always so. Initially, it was a faded relic of human dominions with an aggressive, poisonous atmosphere, rich in rare chemical elements. Mechanisms from dark archaeotechnology were used to gather these generous gifts. Despite everything, the hive cities were inhabited by hundreds of millions of people, and the planet was considered prosperous. But after the onset of the Age of Strife, a slow stagnation began, isolating Ascalon and forcing it to cope with all adversities alone. Ultimately, by the time the Imperial Expeditionary Fleet arrived, the population had dwindled to a few million, and the descendants of the colonists had to subsist on industrial waste and dismantle urban vaults that helped maintain the artificial microclimate. The Imperium brought them hope for a better life, and a group of Magi of Ryza zealously undertook the task. They smoothly launched a series of purification stations capable of processing the toxic clouds, and within 27 years, Ascalon had turned into a fully functioning forge world. Soon, new colonists arrived, and the planet's population started to grow. But the tech priests were attracted not only by the planet's resources, but also by the promise of owning archaeotech. It was believed that the ancient gas factories had long since fallen into disrepair, and their only fate was destruction. But in sealed halls, where no foot had stepped for centuries, wonders of the past were still kept. Techno-archivists eagerly pored over these artifacts, studying and cataloguing them. For the indigenous inhabitants of Ascalon, such actions forewarned disaster, for their culture preserved many myths that spoke of the dangers lurking in the planet's dungeons. But out of sheer gratitude to the Magi, they did not protest much, until it was too late. Later retrieved data indicate that the first sign of catastrophe was a sound resembling a scream. Not a single cry of pain, but a symphonic wail in suffering and agony that rose from the depths of Ascalon. This sound was like a wave, and came from hundreds of passages and cracks in the walls. Almost immediately, the planet's populace was gripped by mass panic, for this cry was spoken of as the grave wail in one of the myths of the Dark Age. Frightened, the inhabitants tried to climb as high as possible to escape these sounds, but they could not. At the upper levels, riots began, and the enforcers were compelled to open fire with live ammunition. 3 hours after the onset of the wailing, martial law was implemented, and a curfew was initiated, as the terrified population needed to be kept under control. The leadership of the enforcers also emphasized that the wailing did not cease, and that the planetary control units could not summon the Ryza subcrypt. All these facts were contained in the hasty Vox transmissions to the orbital beacon Ascalon -3 for subsequent relay. Then the connection with the orbital station was severed, and the service personnel had no choice but to watch the lights of the world below go out. First, the hive cities fell silent, then the cloud processing factories shut down, followed by the outposts, and even the echo of the horrific wail subsided. Ascalon -3 sank into silence. The distress signals were answered by the patrol cruiser Tantalus V of the Armada Imperialis. Scanning the planet, it was found that the life support systems were functioning, but of the 11 million inhabitants, no one remained. Following instructions, the captain of Tantalus V declared a quarantine, organized a blockade of the planet, and sent a request to Sector Command. All that was left for him was to wait. Days passed in silence, then weeks, and the captain kept vigil to ensure the corruption that had destroyed the planet did not escape it. And then, 3 months later, warp transitions opened in the system, through which dozens of warships arrived. Some were dark red, others the color of storm clouds. They carried in their holds the wolves of Rus and the warriors of Mars. The captain was greatly surprised that the sudden silence of an imperial planet had attracted the scrutiny of the great company of one of the most lethal space marine legions, who had brought with them the personal army of the Fabricator General of Mars. I miraculously left Ascalon just before these events began, but I had access to the barge's reports on the axiometronicity, said Cassius, and also to the archives of the Ark Void Serpent of the 11th Great Company of the Wolves. They received an astropathic message composed of a series of mnemonic symbol forms, which I translated into High Gothic as Heretic Omega. Do you know what this implies? Reflecting, Shudamail nodded and then spoke. Techno-blasphemy of the highest order, a sin from the dark age of technology that should not have even been allowed to exist. I am well aware of this, Cassius. This is Silico Animus. Cassius nodded and continued. The received messages were transmitted many times through the ether before they landed on the desks of the dual principalities of Mars. Counteracting forces were assembled and dispatched. Expecting that the upcoming battle would be dreadful, a request was sent to Fenris, and the Lord of Winter and Ruin unleashed the 11th. Squadrons of assault shuttles descended through the poisonous clouds and rushed to 2 landing zones, Bastion Sanctuary and the Ryza sub-temple. There was no resistance, only dry winds swept over the surface, marked with traces of destruction. The battle packs of pale hunters dispersed through the empty bastion, and the Skitarii began to comb the sub-temple. Everywhere there were obvious signs of battle, craters from shots, improvised barricades and bloodstains. But there were no bodies anywhere, meaning the attackers had gathered the bodies and taken them to an unknown location. It was clear that trouble had come from within the forge, and thus it was necessary to descend lower. The sons of Fenris Pax moved through the deserted cities and found similar traces of battle, but no bodies anywhere. And the lower they descended, the fewer signs of battle they saw. But soon the Claws and Nara Halvasna were the first to discover the enemy. Initially, they saw a tall figure in the darkness guarding the entrance to the lower levels beneath the surface of the sanctuary. Recognizing the threat, the creature emitted a supernatural wail that immediately filled the entire cavern. The Astartes' oral compensation countered the noise, and the warriors immediately opened volleys of bolter fire. In the flashes of the shots, they managed to see a lone figure. It was a massive, headless creature, nearly the size of a dreadnought. Its flesh was a corrugated mass of gleaming black-blue substance, inside an exoskeletal shell of gilded metal and pulsating black tubes. The enemy staggered from the bolter hits but did not fall. When the Astartes came close enough, it grabbed one with its enormous clawed hands and tore him apart with no hint of effort. Halvasna charged at the enemy, snipped under its claws and struck at the knee joint, causing the monster to collapse to the ground. The other space wolves quickly approached it and showered it with blows from blades and power axes. The dismembered creature turned out not to be of flesh and blood, but a mechanism of false life, neither servitor nor automaton, but something akin to them, grown and joined together in a shell of hydraulics and gears, and pulsating with unnatural life. When the enemy ceased showing signs of life, the wails abruptly stopped, but a moment later the same wail resounded again in the darkness, echoed by many others somewhere in the depths. The creature was a sentinel, and it had raised the alarm. Hundreds of screaming headless giants emerged from the catacombs. Alongside them whirled ape-like creatures with long, thin limbs. They too had no heads, and their bodies were vertically bisected by chainsaws. Strange amorphous spheres floated around them, firing sharp spikes that pierced ceramite. The space wolves quickly attacked this wave of horror, and in the meantime the Skitarii joined the battle, their radium carbines and volkite discharges meeting the oncoming wave with scorching beams. Meanwhile, in the industrial zone around the sub-temple of Ryza, the Skitarii formed into pentagonal battle formations and divided the area into sectors of fire, but the attacking horrors clung to their unnatural lives to the last and slammed into the ranks of the Skitarii like deadly projectiles. Each giant took a dozen fighters with him before he could be killed. In the dungeons, the refuge, the Astartes briefly gained the upper hand, but new enemies replaced the slaughtered ones, and not only did they attack the space wolves, but they also carried the corpses of the dead into the darkness. Fierce battles raged at the spire of Bastion Control. Here, the defense was led by Jarl Varald Halsden, and his Huskarls in Terminator armor attacked wherever the enemy's assault was particularly intense. Jarl managed not only to participate in the battle, but also to coordinate the Legion's actions to ensure that no pack was cut off. Additionally, he dispatched reinforcements of Skitarii squads from orbit to the besieged units. He saw in the enemy's actions a clearly coordinated strategy. Their attacks were meticulously timed and had a specific purpose. Their amorphous floating spheres circled the wolves' battle formations and attacked their heavy weaponry, while smaller creatures with implanted chain blades launched lightning strikes at the flanks. They became known in the ranks as gut rippers. Jarl hastened to send his iron priests and magos to the Mechanicum in search of answers about the nature of these monsters, for the increasing losses over time would cast doubt on the battle's victory. The tech priests concluded that these creatures indeed belonged to the Heretic Omega. That was the name given to the blasphemous creations based on Dark Age technologies. Synthetic bioplastics in their flesh are a grotesque mockery, sitting between organic life and the artificial purity of the machine, capable of reproducing and regenerating themselves in endless distorted forms like cancer cells. Such entities had been encountered before and had long been marked for extermination. The Iron Priests, in turn, discovered that their scream was a form of echolocation, by which the creatures navigated their surroundings and coordinated their attacks. While the battle raged on the surface, the speaker for the dead, Karim Skarsil, managed to mimic their scream and slipped behind the headless monsters all the way to their lair. He descended deep enough, where roughly hewn stones formed a cavern from which tunnels of dim gold extended. There in the grooves of the walls pulsed the very bioplastic that formed the monster's skin. The speaker for the dead returned and reported his findings, after which Halsden's forces had a very specific objective. Soon, the Void Serpent opened its bomb bays, and the surface near the Hive City was shaken by explosions that broke open paths into the caves beneath the refuge. When the dust settled, a chasm into darkness yawned in the ground, into which storm rams, dropships, and pods of the space wolves descended. Following them, the tertiary axiom directed squads of cybernetic assassins programmed for relentless killing, known as Sicarian Ruststalkers, into the chasm. 24 dreadnoughts, sons of the world, strode forward at the vanguard. They were paving the way for their Legion brethren and the Martian assassins. As they delved into the depths of the technological hell, the dreadnought corps became increasingly scarred by the blows of mechanical creatures. Casualties were numerous, but the Loyalists did not halt until they reached a vast cavern, where they were met by enormous shapeless masses of bioplastic and buzzing hydraulics. Their howls were so intense that the Space Marines' eardrums burst and their auto-senses overloaded. Their biopolymer skin absorbed projectiles, and the Space Wolves' attack faltered, turning into defensive shooting. The mechanical tentacles of the monsters shattered the dreadnought's armor, but the wolves persisted, overcoming their fear. However, the supernatural cybernetic howl did not affect the Sicarian Ruststalkers. Like ants, they swarmed over the horrifying biomass, attacking with their transonic blades. Their strikes left rough gashes in the monster's skin in search of a vulnerable spot, but the wounds quickly healed, and the beast continued its assault. Then Varald Halston surged forward with the huskarls of the Terminators. He plunged into the mass of vile flesh, hacking away with his frost blade. The Terminators echoed his assault, and soon fully grown wounds were bombarded with Tarsis charge grenades. When nauseating flashes flickered beneath the unnatural skin, the creature staggered, its howl distorted, and the carcass collapsed to the ground. The flesh immediately transformed into a hissing chorus, revealing the mechanism beneath. The space wolves howled triumphantly and intensified their assault. Within minutes, the fate of the first nightmare was shared by the second, and the legionnaires stormed into enormous crypts of dim gold and pulsating ink-black flesh, comparable in size to a cathedral. It was here they found the dead inhabitants of Ascalon. They were stacked by the tens of thousands in blood-drained alcoves. Resistance within that hall was minimal, and the Astartes intensified their advance, for Vox reports indicated the monsters were retreating into the catacombs to defend the discovered crypt. In the final hall, the wail of the tomb was replaced by a voice speaking in ancient human languages. At first it threatened and demanded, then it tried to persuade the invaders to stop, and finally it began to plead. In the center of the chamber, surrounded by bioplastic tentacles, floated a dark blue pulsating sphere, in which flickered changing patterns of a golden scheme resembling constellations. Though Halsden was not a magos of the cult of the Omnicia, he immediately understood what it was. Silico Animus, the blasphemy of true machine intelligence, awakened from a long slumber by careless techno-archaeologists. At that very moment, under the influence of a silent command, the Sicarian rust stalkers launched an attack, chanting hymns in binary cant. They crashed into the pale protective field, as did Halsden's power axe. When the shield burned away, the material form of the abhorrent intelligence was subjected to their onslaught. The mechanical scream reached its peak, and then came silence. Reports poured in from everywhere that the monstrous machines were falling to the ground as if the head had been severed from the serpent. The dead of Ascalon were avenged, and the nightmare of the past era was obliterated. What drove it to such a horrific assault remains unknown and incomprehensible, except for the notion that all such blasphemous technology of mad beings should never have been created. The fate of Ascalon was sealed, the nature of the threat identified and annihilated, but who knows what else lies undetected beneath the dust-covered surface of the planet? The Void Serpent and the axiom of trinary leveled all stationary structures and collapsed the underground crypts. Ascalon became a forbidden dead world, a place humanity would never return to. Do you think another specimen of Silico Animus was under the City of Prosperity? Shudhemel broke the silence. Or it was in the arsenal of Eurytus Omicron, Cassius shrugged. Shudhemel turned at the sound of gunfire. His idolithraxis raised their weapons and rushed towards the enemy. The Dark Magos drew a Volkite charger and invited Cassius to join, then disappeared into the doorway. Cassius saw that 3% of the data on the info crystal remained unexplored and continued reading. After the Horus heresy, Ryza sustained large-scale military campaigns of the Imperium, but in the year 925 of the 41st millennium, it was struck by the powerful War of the Orc warboss Grax. Shortly thereafter, the tech priests of Ryza directed every solar second of industrial labor towards survival. Hundreds of millions of greenskins landed on Ryza, and their numbers grew with every passing solar hour. The Imperium met the greenskin attack with more than 20 regiments of the Astra Militarum, fighting alongside the Skitarii squads, battle cohorts of the Legio Cybernetica, and even legions of Titans, yet the Orcs attacked anew with each dawn. The tech priests of Ryza resorted to more inventive measures. Viral bombs rained on the enemy, killing the Xenos by millions, while Castellan robots bombarded the hardiest Orcs with phosphor rounds. Chronicles of Ryza preserved a fragment of a Skitarii squad battle. "Blasphemers!" hissed Princeps Ruscura Trisix for the 100th time that day. He pointed a metal finger at the orcs pouring through the arches. "No matter how many there are, we will prevail. Gears and cogs, to blood!" "To blood!" echoed his fellow Sicarian cohort members dully. They were but a meagre handful, truly content only when scything down enemies of Omnicia. Fortunately, there was plenty of that on Ryza. The ground trembled, and the Sicarian brood dispersed like water striders on a pond's surface. Through the pious psalms that Trisix preferred to play before the bloodshed, a dull rumble cut through, which grew into a deafening roar. When Trisix lifted his head, 6,834 greenskin warriors surged onto the steps of the Basilica Mecca patentee. "Glory!" Trisix shouted and jumped onto the shoulder of a toppled statue. He soared into the air, the dull sunlight of Ryza glinting off the fully armed figure. Then he plunged his transonic blades into the armoured bodies of the orcs at the vanguard of the greenskin tide. Behind him a deadly rhythm followed, heralding destruction. Heads rolled, orc hands and legs were severed, tracing bloody arcs through the air. "Indeed," thought Trisix, "today is a beautiful day for the instruments of the Omnicia." Above the polar megacities, orc fighters were besieged by the onager dune crawlers, modified to climb sheer walls. Rescue teams were reviving fallen god machines with rituals and incense, while orc mechs resurrected their gargants with welding torches and foul language. On Ryza, victory was achieved not through attrition but through ingenuity, a trait that tech priests often regarded as bordering on heresy. In the end, the orcs were thrown into confusion after 40 standard years of battle, following the death of Grax by the hands of the warlord-class titan Pugnus Vindicta. With the loss of their war boss, the Greenskins began fighting amongst themselves, each vying for the right to lead the Wa'ar. This significantly simplified the Magos' task of exterminating the Xenos on Ryza. After the fall of Cadia during the 13th Black Crusade of Abaddon the Despoiler, the galaxy was torn asunder, creating the monstrous warp rift known as the Cicatrix Maledictum, stretching from the Eye of Terror to the Gedix anomaly at the eastern edge of the galaxy. Many worlds were cut off from the Imperium and became targets for Xenos and heretics, emerging from the rift in increasing waves. No less than 7 Forge worlds were completely destroyed, and several more were declared missing. At the call of the awakened Primarch Reboot Gilliman, over a dozen Forge worlds, including Mars, Ryza, Metallica, and Triplex Fall, dispatched reinforcements to Ultramar to aid the Ultramarines in repelling the Death Guard and achieving victory in the Plague Wars. This was the last recorded entry of the Forge world Ryza. Cassius placed the crystal in storage, and taking up his Serpenta, headed towards the exit. He felt his emotion inhibitors ceasing to function, and, pointing the weapon's barrel towards the firefight, the Magos did something he hadn't done in several hundred years. He smiled.